Hi, this is Dan Sullivan, and I'm here with Ted Gortney, who's the president of the Council of Georgist Organizations. I'm the vice president, and Polly is a longtime Georgist and economist at Columbia, right? And
Retired from that, but thank you.
Does that make you emeritus?
No, I'm not even emeritus, but I keep an affiliation though.
And she's going to talk to us on the links between Darwinism and Georgism and the controversy a little bit. And I will just pass it to Polly and let her take it from there. Good.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation and welcome everybody out there. I can't see you, but you can see my messy office one of these days. Maybe I'll get a nice back screen like Dan's. Anyway, I'm talking about two great minds of the 19th century. Charles Darwin is probably better known to most of you. Henry George is very well known to the Georgists among the audience, but probably not too well known to the people who tuned in out of an interest in Darwin. Just in brief, Henry George was a very famous economist, political activist, philosopher. He published a very famous book called Progress and Poverty in 1879. It was a worldwide bestseller, and he was enormously influential, at least into the early 20th century. So I'm going to start with Darwin, who is better known to most of you. Darwin was considerably older than George. He was born in 1809, very famous for his trip, The Voyage of the Beagle, which I think was published. He became very famous for publishing about his trip, his 5-year trip around South America and elsewhere, and all the wonderful things he observed. And then he sat down and started mulling over the things he had observed, taking care of all of his collections, corresponding with everyone, but thinking about evolution or natural selection was pretty controversial. So he kind of sat on it and sat on it and sat on it. But meanwhile, he was experimenting, and what probably you don't know was that he raised pigeons. In fact, he was breeding pigeons for some 20 years before the origin of species, that is, crossing all sorts of different fancy varieties. And I picked a picture of one particularly absurd fancy pigeon, the pygmy pouter pigeon. I mean, I can't imagine a sillier looking bird. In any case, in 1858, Darwin had a big shock. He corresponded a couple of times with a much younger naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, but Wallace sent him a paper in which essentially he explained natural selection, I think in some 30 pages, and Darwin panicked. And fortunately, some friends came to the rescue, and some of Darwin's notes on evolution and Wallace's paper were presented in 1858. And in 1859, Darwin published On the Origin of Species, which was supposed to be just sort of an outline of his big book, saying that, whoops, wait a moment, just please don't change the slide until I ask you to. Okay. Anyway, saying species evolved from common ancestors by natural selection, and that was taken from his pigeon breeding, which was artificial selection. So he said somewhere out there in nature, the same kind of thing is happening. And of course, this was a big controversy. In 1864, philosopher Herbert Spencer, a very famous 19th century intellect, coined the term survival of the fittest, which Darwin eventually sort of accepted as a synonym for natural selection, but I think it really isn't, because it implies a struggle for improvement that evolution has a positive direction, which of course went over very well with the Victorians. The empire was expanding, the British were the greatest in the world, and so forth. So this was the origin of species. Now we can move to the next slide. George published his first magnum opus, Progress and Poverty, in 1879. And in the concluding chapters, he attacks Darwinism as providing scientific support for Malthus, that is, for the Malthusian claim that the rich Western nations are superior and the poor create their own poverty by overbreeding and so forth. And for those of you who are not familiar with George, I wanted to read a couple of short passages from Progress and Poverty, just also so you just get the flavor of George's wonderful writing. So this is what he had, a little bit of what he had to say on Darwin. He said, the prevailing belief now is that the progress of civilization is a development or evolution in the course of which man's powers are increased and his qualities improved by the operation of causes similar to those which are relied upon as explaining the genesis of species, that is, the survival of the fittest and the hereditary transmission of acquired qualities. And, I could read some more, but just as the Malthusian theory harmonized with the existing prejudices both of the rich and the poor, so does the explanation of progress as a gradual race improvement harmonize with the vulgar opinion which accounts by race differences for differences in civilization. It has given coherence and a scientific formula to opinions which already prevailed. Its wonderful spread since the time Darwin first startled the world with his Origin of Species has not been as and says the English victories were in common English opinion due to the natural superiority of Englishmen to frog-eating Frenchmen and so forth. It's wonderful writing. Okay, so George takes his last chapters to show that humans have not evolved, at least physically not evolved during recorded history, and he looks at what he calls the petrified civilizations, such as China and India, that were thriving when the British were cavemen or the equivalent. And he says that true progress of civilization comes from cooperation among equals. It's not genetic, it comes from cooperation among equals. And he later devoted a book to denouncing Spencer. So this is George versus Darwin. And that's sort of my taking off point, because George didn't really have too much to say about evolution except to say that it did not apply to humans during recorded history. Oh, next slide. Okay, so here is George. I am claiming now that George was more right than he knew about the weakness of natural selection, and that his focus on inequality and monopoly can help us understand evolution. And this is a famous cartoon of George battling monopoly rings and deals and general corruption and inequality and so forth. I mean, there were a lot of cartoons about George because in the late 19th century, he was a very visible public figure. He ran for mayor of New York, lost more due to corruption, ran again, and he died during his second race for mayor of New York. So, next slide, please. Okay, Darwin himself had reservations about survival of the fittest. He worried about peacock's feathers in particular. So in 1871, he published his second and bigger book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. And he described a couple of other forms of natural selection, both of which seem to impair fitness. And this is a big problem if you're saying that whatever survives must be the fittest. And these are two things. First was what he called the law of battle, and that males of different species weaponize to compete to control territory and or females. And the second is the taste for the beautiful, runaway sexual selection that impairs fitness, like peacock's tails. And I'll explain that a bit more in a moment. So next slide. Dan, next slide, please. Yeah. Okay, here are some images for Darwin's law of battle, just so we know what we're talking about here. There's a California sea lion, and the males grow absolutely immense. And what they do is a big male will monopolize a particular beach where the females come ashore to have their pups, and then they will mate with the females before the females go back out to sea. And so the males fight over this territory, and they get bigger and bigger. So you've got one big male and then some smaller males around the fringes looking for an opportunity to horn in. And speaking of horns, a couple of staghorn beetles fighting it out over a little bit of territory. A bull elk, again, those massive horns, help him defend his flock of females, or whatever you call them. Baboons are particularly nasty, and they bite each other, and they bite the females, and so I would not want to get near a baboon with a baboon's fangs. But that's the law of battle. Next slide. Okay, Darwin had a taste for the beautiful, and I should explain how sexual selection works. You have a female bird usually, and this bird, for whatever reasons, likes a male with a red tail, say. So she picks a male with a red tail, and as a result, her offspring tend to have more of a red tail, and that's the males, and the females prefer males with a red tail. So you can see you can have sort of a runaway, that is a positive feedback loop, which you get, long red tails. I mean, obviously there's a limit, but not too great a limit, because if you look at peacocks and other birds that have really fancy tails, obviously these are kind of a hindrance and make them more liable to predators. So this is a big problem for evolutionary theorists, because they find it hard to accept that beauty impairs fitness, and rather they'll say that, well, this bird is so gorgeous, it shows that he's super healthy, and therefore showing off how beautiful your feathers are is an adaptive feature. Well, I reviewed a recent book by an ornithologist at Yale called Richard. His book's called Evolution of Beauty, and he says, no, Darwin is right. Sexual selection really does happen, and his prime example is, well, Prum is an expert on manakins, which are little tiny neotropical birds, and his exhibit A is something called the club-winged manakin, and there's a pair of them right there on the lower left of the slide. And the club-winged manakin does something very interesting, which is, instead of singing, what he does for the female is he all of a sudden and you guys, you can go look up club-winged manakins and see this in action. He dips his head down, he puts his feathers up his tail, and he rubs his wings together at top speed to produce a squeak. I mean, it's a little beep, and then he'll do it again and go beep. And in any case, to evolve this ability to squeak with his feathers, the males have developed, or the manakins have developed, very heavy-boned wings, which this includes the females, and it clearly impairs both sexes' ability to fly. So it's very hard to argue, Prum says, that this is an adaptive feature rather than runaway sexual selection. So, there's a world of beautiful birds out there, and again, Prum's argument is that these represent various forms of runaway sexual selection. And just to add, it's not, this kind of runaway selection isn't confined to animals or birds in particular, because you can tell the same story about beautiful flowers. That is some line of bees, well, they're all genetically the same, and likes a pink flower. So they selectively go for pink flowers, which get a little better pollinated. And again, you get the same positive feedback loop producing beautiful flowers. So this is Prum, who has been going out and defending sexual selection. Okay, but that's not the only problem with adaptation narrowly considered. So next slide, please. Next, yeah. Okay, here is a paleoecologist by the name of Keith Bennett, who says that evolution is chaotic, not primarily determined by adaptation. And he does soil samples. He takes lake cores and looks at the levels of pollen and so forth. So he's following climate changes, and he's saying there's just not very good connection between what the species are doing and big climate changes like glaciation. And so he says evolution is chaotic. And for those of you who know what that means, it means that a very small difference at the beginning can have a very large effect in the long run, which is known as the butterfly effect. A butterfly flaps its wings in China and you get a storm in the US or something like that. But the point, and of course, beauty selection is perfectly chaotic. Just the accidental preference somewhere along the line of a female bird for a male whose wings were a little squeaky, and you're off and running. And so Bennett says, quoting a historian, saying that evolution is just one damn thing after another. There is no predictable direction to evolution. So next slide. Okay, here's another critic of standard adaptive theory, and this is geneticist Richard Goldschmidt, excuse me, I pronounced that right, says that the usual story with adaptation of cumulative small adaptations just doesn't fly. There have been some big changes, and it couldn't be just, the accumulation of small changes. So he coined this term, hopeful monster, for very rare major evolutionary changes. Well, it just so happens that one such change has been recently identified, in fact, just last year. Some researchers found that that apes lost their tails about 25 million years ago from a single mutation. And this must originally have been at least a deleterious mutation. The same mutation in like Manx cats means that people with two copies of cats with two copies of the gene they die. So somehow this gene got accepted and modified and became part of our human heritage. And this picture here is very interesting because there's a new book out called Ancient Bones. I didn't put it in the slide, claiming that in fact, humans evolved from already bipedal apes living around the Mediterranean Sea area, called the Tethys Sea back then. And so human ancestors, at least as of 6 million years ago, were already walking upright. And here is a sort of a reconstruction of a possible human ancestor called Danubius guggenmosi, again, an upright ape. And then the theory goes that that gorillas and chimps subsequently started leaning over because they were much bigger than these little guys. Anyway, I don't need to go into this, but the point is, hopeful monsters are another question mark raised against simple adaptation or natural selection. Next slide. Hello, next slide. Oh, yeah. So, okay, so Henry George is economics, which was taken from the classical economists Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, and the lot, has something to offer about understanding evolution, and then provides an alternative to simple adaptation. Again, in classical economics, land and location are central concepts, and superior land delivers what's called economic rent, a surplus that can be used productively or wasted. And George talked about wealthy landowners holding good land out of use at the expense of the rest of society. But in any case, in classical economics, there's a huge difference between good land and marginal land. So we could predict that wealthy landowners will use their resources for war or luxury, but of course that's not adaptation or progress. Now, if this model applies to animal species, non-human species, there's of course not George's moral implication. Okay, next slide. So a quick run through of classical economics as applied to species and evolution. So starting out, every species has superior locations. And in classical economics, again, superior locations yield economic rent compared to marginal locations. A landlord of a superior location can charge someone else rent for mere use, for merely because he owns it. For a non-human species, superior locations offer more food or protection or breeding opportunities. And I'll show you some examples of that later. But so the role of superior locations also applies in animal species. And in superior locations, a species reproduces above replacement, and the excess offspring will go to marginal locations. And these are a couple of illustrations of the law of rent by the late Lindy Davies. If you see on the left, the land with 4 trees on it is more valuable than the land with 3 trees, which is more valuable than the land with 2 trees or 1 tree. And the second illustration, again, shows that superiority of land isn't just agricultural. He's got some sort of little trapezoidal island there, but the most valuable land is the land on the harbors. As we know, New York, that's where I live. Anywhere with a big harbor is going to have mostly the most valuable land. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and here is the key argument that in superior locations, there is low adaptive pressure. And that's certainly true in classical economics. Owners of superior locations leave land vacant or spend their income on luxuries. Thorsten Veblen, who was an admirer of George, wrote about conspicuous consumption, which is, clearly wasteful consumption. I want to read a short bit from Adam Smith, who, even though he depended on the elite for his income, nonetheless had some unkind things to say about large landowners. And here's what Smith wrote about great proprietors. To improve land with profit, like all other commercial projects, requires an exact attention to small savings and small gains, of which a man born to great fortune, even though naturally frugal, is very seldom capable. He embellishes perhaps 400 or 500 acres in the neighborhood of his house at 10 times the expense which the land is worth after all his improvements, and finds that if he was to improve his whole estate in the same manner, and he has little taste for any other, he would be a bankrupt before he finished the 10th part of it, and so on. So, the rich are wasteful, and heaven knows we see what goes on at big corporations. Executive helicopters, luxurious offices. Well, they used to pick for pretty secretaries. They probably still do. a whole bunch of luxury that just cannot be explained as simple profit-making behavior. So again, among species, I claim that occupants of superior locations can afford to evolve variations that cost energy and reduce reproduction to a degree, and that includes sexual selection. In superior locations, there is limited check on genetic drift. Now, genetic drift is there's always, continual mutations going on. Most of them don't have any effect, but any species has a whole bunch of different mutations, and genetic drift happens when a different mutation, for whatever accidental reason, takes hold, becomes dominant. Maybe the birds turn bluer, but many varieties can thrive, and that includes hopeful monsters, because if things are good, even if you've lost your tail, you can find and make such a good living that ultimately it doesn't matter. And again, in superior locations, evolution can go in many different directions. There's no such thing as fit or perfectly fit. So I would call it something like survival of the adequately fit or the relatively lucky, but that lets you go off in a whole bunch of different directions depending on chance. So next slide, please. Okay, every species seeks out superior locations. That's just instinct built in. But throughout human history, most wars have been about capturing or defending valuable locations. The excuse is religion. And animal species move up the gradient towards better conditions or travel in search of better conditions. And bacteria twirl their little propellers and swim towards food and away from toxic substances, basic. There's the wonderful saga of female wolf F003 of Ile Royale. That's an island in the middle of Lake Superior, where there's been a population of wolves that has declined. They're putting more wolves in there. Well, this one lady wolf left the island with a collar on her, and they tracked her. She went back to the mainland, and she went absolutely zigzagging all over the place until the battery finally died on her collar. But there have been many cases of animals that with a collar, radio collar, being tracked all over creation. And again, they are obviously, I would say, looking for good conditions where maybe they don't, the food is good, maybe there's a mate, whatever. But the point is, this is not unusual for an animal to go looking for a better situation. But what also happens is animal species return to their birthplace to reproduce. And I think this is the cause of what has been something of a mystery, which is Sympatric speciation. Cichlid fish in Lake Victoria, which is this giant lake in the middle of Africa. There are some 500 species that have popped up in the 17,000 years since Lake Victoria last dried up. Well, if you have fish coming into a new lake and they find several different spots that are suitable for breeding, and then the ones that grew up in a particular spot tend to return to the same spot, and pretty soon you've got the makings of a species. Anyway, that's my hypothesis. Okay, next slide. Okay, and crucially, occupants of superior locations must defend their valuable monopoly. That is, usually they do, especially if they are top predators. In primitive economies, we're back to humans, owners defend their land by force. In modern economies, the state defends your land. That is, you have title to your land, and the police will come out and protect you. Among species, the occupants of superior land locations defend them against their own, against other species. And they may use physical force or poison, as some plants do, or other means. I read there's something called a wolf tree, which spreads out its branches and it goes out of its way maybe to shade out the ground so that young plants can't come up. Anyway, here's male chimps on patrol, and they can be very aggressive, and they will kill any stray chimp that they run across from either from another group or just a unfortunate female that has been pushed out of her natal group and is looking for a home. Well, oops, sorry. Next slide, please. Okay, then occupants of superior locations must prevent overpopulation. And if you know something about British history or even US history, originally grants of land from the king came with laws of primogeniture and entail. That is, the great lord who got this particular estate from the king was allowed only to pass it on to his oldest male heir. And entail laws meant that you couldn't break up your estate, you couldn't sell it. It had to stay together as one piece, and if you were a spendthrift, well, too bad, you still couldn't do anything about it. In the United States, started off with primogeniture and entail, but Thomas Jefferson, I think, was the person who kind of pushed to get those laws eliminated in the US. Okay. Now, among species, the occupants of superior locations prevent overpopulation. They kill, abandon, expel surplus offspring. They have many and various ways of doing that. And when you have communal species, the subordinates often are unable to breed. That's a picture of a couple of Australian magpies, or beautiful birds. And the one on the right is intimidating the subordinate one on the left, which has rolled over on its back in sort of tribute to the boss. And if you've watched the stories about the meerkats, again, only one female breeds, and the other meerkats help take care of the babies. So in any case, overpopulation, despite what Malthus said, is generally under control, except in some instances where humans have intervened, but that's another story. Next slide. Next slide, yeah. And as for what goes on in the marginal locations, the occupants probe, they wait, or they search. Among humans, poor people poach on the lord's estate. You know, all of these stories about poachers poaching rabbits from the lord, or they invade rich estates. That's been a big problem, quote unquote, in Latin America, where you get an empty land and some workers move in and start to farm, or they wander around in search of work. And among species, occupants wait for opportunity. Tree seedlings, there's a wonderful article about in Natural History recently about how the ground under trees is often carpeted with the tiny little, like he calls it, a Lilliputian forest, and those are tree seedlings, and they may last as long as 10 years, waiting for something to happen to the canopy above so that they can grow up, and if not, they eventually die. And young adult birds, mammals, fish also lurk around the periphery of good pieces of territory, or of course they go off on a search like female wolf 003. And in communal species, subordinates often become reluctant helpers. And you see that in wolves and meerkats and many other species in the Australian magpies. Again, the subordinates, either they can go off and try and mate and have a family somewhere else on inferior property, or they can hang around and help out and hope that when mom or pop gets carried off by a hawk, that they can take over. Okay, so that's the next slide. Okay, so let me take a passing swipe at neoclassical economics, which replaced classical economics in the late 1800s, as Mason Gaffney has claimed, as a response to George's crusade for land taxes, which is another story. But the neoclassical economics merged land into capital, so we have only capital and labor. Location and rent disappear, and economics is seen as zero sum. Inequality disappears, replaced by efficiency, survival of the most profitable. This nonsense is what you learn in Economics 101, and if they get to anything about monopoly, it's in the last chapters. But the nice thing about neoclassical economics is it's mathematically tractable, because you're maximizing. Once you're maximizing, you turn the crank on the calculus. Okay. So, yeah. And adaptationist evolution also has some of the same properties as neoclassical economics, the survival of the fittest, because you're maximizing, it's mathematically tractable. And this became dominant in the late 1800s, led by Alfred Russel Wallace, that's George's frenemy, who was ironically a George supporter. And location plays little role, none for rent. And again, the assumption that life is zero sum. And it's mathematically tractable, which is very nice. You can build all sorts of beautiful mathematical models. And of course, the alternative is a tautology, that if the fittest are those that are survived, then the survival of the fittest. But what does that mean? So this is sort of straightforward adaptationist. Ecologists are kind of stuck because they have a choice between something that doesn't seem to be so, and a tautology. So next slide. Fortunately, the explosion of inequality in the United States or in the world has at least sent some ecologists looking at wealth inequality in nature. Growing human inequality, as I said, has finally inspired some ecologists to look at inequality of wealth within species. And this particular article that was actually published in this December and picked up by the New York Times. It's called The Nature of Privilege, Intergenerational Wealth in Animal Societies. And the authors, they present this tree of life showing species with material inheritance, but this is just a sampling, because it's all over the place that you have animals, societies where wealth is transmitted to a small subset of that society, whether it's in the form of a location. There's a red squirrel sitting on a midden of pine nuts. So those baby red squirrels will do a lot better than the red squirrels that don't have that prime location. And many, many more. And the author, the prime author of this article, is just getting started in finding intergenerational transmission of wealth, and usually nest sites, all sorts, but it's all tied to location. So it's very gratifying to me to see that finally, I've been, working on this hypothesis for a long time, but finally, ecologists have started looking at the evidence, and the evidence is there. Very exciting. Okay, next. And okay, isn't evolution wild? This is a shot, a painting from a paleo artist, J. Maternus, of just to give you the idea of some of the crazy things that evolution does. I mean, you can't call that fittest. These crazy animals lived about 10 million years ago in the Great Plains of the US. And if you look at them, they've got 4 horns. They've got 2 sort of cow horny kinds of things on their heads, and then these long things on their snouts with 2 more horns. I mean, you just can't believe the crazy things that evolution does. Like Bennett says, one damn thing after another. in any case, so I thank you there, and I'm very much looking forward to answering questions, or maybe you can stump me with some that I haven't thought of. Anyway, thanks so much. Hello.
Oh, hello. We have one question from Mark Sullivan. He said, "Can you elaborate on the term trackable?"
Yeah, a model is tractable if you can easily manipulate the equations to show the relationship between various variables. That makes it tractable. If you maximize survival of the fittest, that is your maximizing. You're finding out who is the fittest subject to certain constraints. You just turn the crank. That's an equation. If it's only survival of the moderately fit, that could go anywhere. That's not mathematically tractable. And needless to say, economists love tractable models, and they tend to kind of run away with them. And I think that's one of the big problems of the many problems with economics today is, you go with the models and then you try and find out if there's something out in the real world that can fit into your clever model.
Aha, okay. Jonathan Trent asked, what about migrating species? What does location look like for marine environments?
Well, that is a very good question. And I know Jonathan has a lot of interest in marine environments because he's working on algae, among other things. Usually there is a critical environment, and that's usually the environment where where reproduction takes place. So there are better locations and worser locations. And I think marine environments are particularly interesting because unless you're on the bottom, there isn't a fixed spot that you can defend. So it gets a lot mushier when you're talking about defending prime locations. Nonetheless, I mean, I think it happens, and I'm trying to figure out a good way to work that out. For instance, orcas are very egalitarian. Again, I think because there's not a whole lot of defense of territory, and of course, primitive humans, that is hunter-gatherers in most circumstances, are also very egalitarian because there's not much territory to defend, or rather the territory is pretty equal. So it varies a great deal, and chimps are very aggressive territorial defenders. Bonobos not so much. This is something that I'm hoping to work out a little better. But thank you, Jonathan. You're right on target with that.
All right. He also has another thing. He said I think Polly's argument about the importance of superior locations is compelling, but what about the impact of time and the rate of change?
The impact of time and the rate of change. I'm not quite sure what that means. Time and the rate of change. In places like the tropics where very little changes from year to year, you get a lot more species. You get very low number of species up in the Arctic, and that's where you get things like lemming booms, because you don't have the complex species web up there, so you'll get boom and bust among the lemmings and other populations. You get owl explosions, as they're called, snowy owl eruptions, again having to do with the fairly skimpy ecological network up there. I'm not sure that's an answer, but
okay. I'm going to wait.
Well, I have a couple. Gil Herman asks, can Georgist economics be represented in a mathematical model?
Well, I have tried to do that with building models of inequality of land. I'm not, and of course, yes, I'm doing maximizing and showing that if you have a very unequal society, horribly simplified, yeah, you will have high wages in the rich section and low wages in the poor section. And a whole, I've done, they're on my website, I've done mathematical models of inequality, 3-factor models. That's part of what's wrong with neoclassical economics, is they merge land into capital, which, was a political decision, but it makes for a very oversimplified model. Anyway,
Marx did that, and then the right wing found that very convenient, and they adopted that. It was Marx did it so he could attack capital as if it were privilege, and the right wing adopted it so they could defend privilege as if it were capital.
Well, okay, I'll have to check that out.
We have another attendee asked, isn't superior in the eye of the beholder? Are some locations better than another? I think it's not an either or to me, but.
Well, it's one way to certainly identify superior locations is that's where they want to go. It's where breeding is most successful, usually the key location. Now, somebody asked something about animals that move around, that migrate. There are these wonderful birds that migrate from Alaska to the tip of to New Zealand, I think. What are they called? I've forgotten the name of the birds. But there are generally key locations for reproduction. And those are the ones that make the big difference, I think, for evolution. Or
yeah,
I'm not sure if that's, but species, and sometimes the location is always a moving target. If you're a buckfly and you like to live in a zebra's gut, well, the zebra is a moving target. Or if you're a slime mold and you like to grow on a cow pat, well, that's a moving target too. And what the slime mold does when the food runs out on the cow pat, they form this little budding organism, and they send off spores, and that they hope will land on another cow pat. So
Brett Weinstein and Heather Hying are evolutionary biologists that came out with a book called The Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 20th Century. And one of the things Brett Weinstein always says is, if you don't understand something, you have to keep looking for an evolutionary reason. So with sexual selection, like if this female bird selects a male bird with heavy wings, could that mean that maybe he won't fly away, and so he'll stay to help raise the other birds, or things that he can still fly short distances, which is necessary to bring food back to the nest, but he's less likely to just fly off and find another young chick, so to speak. The explorer, about 1 to 2% of the salmon do not go back and spawn in the same river. And the evolutionary
those are the explorers. Those are the explorers, and there are always a few penguins will wander off and find another breeding spot.
Yeah, and their purpose, if they all return to the same place, well, most of the explorers die. But I guess the point is that the ones who survive expand the species, and the ones who, if they all did that, they would die. But if none of them did that, they would only exist in one river. So
yeah, well, I mean, absolutely. And I think postulate that there is an instinct to seek out superior terrain, and usually that means going back to the place where you were born, but if that place is crowded or degraded or something, there may be a secondary impulse to say, okay, well, I'm going to take my chances somewhere else and go explore somewhere else, you know, the way Wolf F003 was doing, or there've been mountain lions and others tracked over enormous differences, obviously looking for a better home. So that's, you know, that's
All right.
part
And
Mark,
my final thing was that primogeniture arose because the landlord was not originally the landowner. He was basically the de facto governor of that land. And Adam Smith writes that the purpose of primogeniture was, since the landlord had to raise his own army to defend the land, that allowing the land to be divided among the heirs divided the defense capacity and the governing capacity, so that the smaller
I think you mean
fiefdoms
entail.
well, yeah, well, both that this dividing a barony, or whatever you would want to call it, made it more vulnerable to attack from rival lords. This is before the Norman conquest and before strong kingship developed, that the lords were essentially the lord and protector was the phrase. So
Yeah,
that
well,
the rationale
that
for
may
that
be.
disappeared with formal government.
Well, but the practice continued because Thomas Jefferson worked to get rid of it in the U.S. So it was part of the ownership contract, whatever the origin. But the point is, I'm just making an analogy that you know, the ruling elite likes to keep its numbers exclusive, and the, you know, an animal elite, even if it's only temporary, likes to do the same thing.
Okay.
I have a bunch of questions in chat from Mark Sullivan. Wasn't Alfred Russel Wallace interested in both evolution and land reform, and so could be considered a kind of link between Darwin and George?
He was interested in what? I missed a couple of
All
words
right,
there.
wasn't he interested in both evolution and in land reform?
Yeah,
couldn't he-
absolutely. But
Okay,
in terms of evolution, he was a diehard adaptionist who never accepted sexual selection.
okay.
And yes, he was also a spiritualist. I mean, he thought the, you know, human intellect came from on high or something, you know. So he was kind of mixed up. But yeah, he was a land nationalizer. He was an admirer of George. Absolutely. And of course, he way outlived Darwin. I think he died in what, 2013. He lived a good long life.
Okay. Jonathan Trent commented, locations vary seasonally, and there are decanal variation. Therefore, the best location may not always be so. Was his comment to you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why you have to not only return to your home turf, but if need be, you have to search.
Okay. And then Bill Batt has asked, what of the argument that for humans, society rules swamp natural selection may not be true of other species?
Whoa, run that one by me again.
I know, I was reading it. What of the argument that for humans, society's rules swamp natural selection may not be true for other species?
Well, society's rules certainly swamp natural selection among humans, because a lot of us, including me, survive who wouldn't have survived under more primitive conditions. But I didn't get the rest of the question.
I didn't get it either. So well, Bill, if you can maybe clarify that for us a little bit. Alfredo.
I guess the societies with bad rules tend to not survive as societies too. That's the things tend to get put to
Well,
the
that's,
macro level.
I mean, look, it's George's point that civilizations rise and civilizations fall. You know, they carry the seeds of their own destruction. At first, you get a lot of cooperation and growth, and everybody's happy. But then you get growing inequality, and eventually the society or the empire falls apart, just like the U.S. empire is now doing. And another empire rises. So in 20 years, maybe we will be subservient to the Chinese, or if climate change hasn't wiped us out by then.
Alfredo
or
has a
winter.
question.
Maybe we need nuclear winter as an antidote to global warming.
Alfredo has a question. The two quantitative superstitions derived from scientism, distortions of science, quantitative corroboration. One, if it's not measurable, it doesn't exist. Two, everything can be measured, was his comment.
I don't know what scientism is.
He said distortions of science, quantitative cooperation, corroboration.
No, scientism,
corroboration.
Cooperation, probably. Scientism
corroboration seems to be the word he's just put.
Scientism is the making science into a religion and kind of weaponizing scientific findings as if they are the only truth.
The problem is you can measure all sorts of things, but then the results may be determined by something you didn't measure. You know, there's multiple dimensions. I mean, this is the problem with survival of the fittest. Like, what is fit? You can be fit along a huge variety of dimensions. Which one and where you go is a total accident. And that's Stephen Jay Gould's point too, that you know, you can rewind the tape, but you can never quite get back to the same beginning. And if you let it run again, you'll wind up someplace different. So, you know, evolution is not deterministic. In fact, there's a guy doing a wonderful experiment with bacteria, and he keeps separating his vials of bacteria, and they all are in some sort of a solution, and watching how they evolve, and then he will freeze them at one point, and then, you know, run the experiment over again, and they go somewhere else. So, you know, evolution is not deterministic.
There's a sign on, there was a sign on Einstein's office wall that said, "Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts."
Sounds good.
We've got a bunch of questions here in chat. Can you factor power, especially political power, into the model?
Can I factor political power into the model? Well, I mean, certainly the pair of brothers that run a chimp group have a lot of political power. Yeah, there's a wonderful book called Primate Politics. You know, yes, animal societies are political. You know, scratch my back and I'll scratch yours, and I'll bite him and I won't bite you. But I don't know about, I mean, political power is important in any kind of social group, but I'm not quite sure where you're going.
Jim Fredrickson commented that the bird name you were trying to think about that flies so far away are Arctic terns.
I don't think so. There's a big article about them in the latest Smithsonian magazine.
Right, I just saw that myself.
They have the very long bills. They're begin with a W or something. It's funny. I read a whole article about them and I don't remember what they are.
Okay. Another question. Human beings change their environment with supply change. Does this mean human beings are not naturally evolving in your theory?
Well, I don't think that there is any serious evolution going on among humans, and this has been the great controversy over racism, that there are no serious or significant differences between humans of different races. And that was the point of Stephen Jay Gould's book, The Mismeasure of Man, that where, you know, these scientists tried to make something out of nothing, which was really a justification for imperialism. And that was, of course, George's point too. And you know, there was the whole social Darwinism movement, which took off in the late 18th century or 19th century, and really wound up with the horrifying eugenics movement that didn't really peter out until World War II in the US.
Okay, another one. Can't wealth create superior locations for them themselves and create inferior locations that will weaken the others and make them less competitive, or at least more dependent?
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, certainly the rich create lovely cocoons for themselves, and I'm sure that as the waters rise, that they will find ways to, well, maybe they'll all move to Denver, but they will find ways to protect themselves and leave the rest of us sloshing around in the mud. I don't know what the question was, though.
All right. Scott Baker has comments. Is differentiation selected for by evolution? That is, does being different from members of another species provide survival value? Maybe that's why peacocks took so different, even if it doesn't directly help to its advantage, to the advantage. So it's the advantage of one individual not to mate with the doves.
Okay, you're right. I think what you're getting at is the argument, which I think probably has something to it, which is that once you have a species, a new species developing, you know, peacocks with maybe purple peacocks as opposed to turquoise peacocks, and if they hybridize and the hybrids are less viable, then that factor can produce a push to separating the species faster and further. And I think, you know, that's an argument in some cases that's been documented, but that doesn't change the basic argument that, you know, runaway sexual selection is, you know, again, kind of a random thing. You know, one female likes a particular male, and it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, or well, a can run away.
Okay.
Judith,
Dan, do you want to take? There's a question in Q&A,
Yeah,
and then I got
yeah.
10 more.
Judith Hersfeld asked, does the thesis of guns, germs, and steel comport with your view? Guns, Germs, and Steel is a popular book.
I haven't read the whole, I read some of it. You know, I think his argument is that Guns, Germs, and Steel is right there in the title, which is that explorers came over to the New World with both diseases and weapons, and they were able to take over and decimate the local population. Now, what that has to do with evolution or survival, I'm not sure. I mean, that's just nasty human history.
I always wondered what they thought would happen, because most of these diseases originated in Asia, and if Europeans hadn't discovered the New World, Asians would have. I can't imagine that it would have been any kinder to them to have been populated by Asians that had that harbored these diseases even more and had developed stronger immunities to them than we had.
Well, I mean, I don't know, Dan. You know, when you have international travel, you get international plagues, such as we're dealing with at the moment, and you get, you know, international species travel where you don't want them, and you know, this has been going on obviously since there was travel. Somebody brought raccoons to Japan, and now they're a big pest. But I don't know quite what to make of guns, germs, and steel. You know, it's just another ugly chapter in human history, certainly.
Right. Chris Fader has a comment about a relevant and powerful new book by Richard Heinberg, published in 2021, Power, Limits, and Prospect for Human Survival, from the blurb, How Has Homo sapiens, one species among millions, become powerful enough to threaten a mass extinction and disrupt the Earth's climate? Why have we developed so many ways of oppressing one another? Can we change our relationship with power to avert ecological catastrophe, reduce social, hold on, as I'm trying to, inequality, and stave off collapse? Weaving together findings from a wide variety of discipline, Power traces how 4 key elements develop to give humans extraordinary power: tool-making ability, language, social complexity, and the ability to harness energy sources, most significantly fossil fuels. The book explores self-limitations of power, is rooted in evolution and in human history. Through our memory of it has been buried under a century of fossil fuel driven economic growth. Whoa, I hope that's a wow. Yeah, it sounds like a great book. I mean, it sort of puts everything together. And I thank Chris for that.
Yeah, it sounds like a great book. I mean, I tend to be kind of pessimistic at this point. I think, you know, it's the tragedy of the unregulated commons, that the idea that the powers that be are going to be able to get together and stop this crisis without at least taking over and becoming a small elite that will rule the rest of the world to their own advantage. You know, according to George, civilizations rise and civilizations fall, and there's nothing surprising about what's happening now except the massive scale of it.
You know, that fits for what Scott Baker commented. Our brains are smaller than Neanderthals. Are we evolving to be dumber than more tame?
I think Neanderthals also had bigger bodies. I think there's.
I think so. I think they had bigger bodies than us.
Between brain size and body size, I hope.
Yeah.
Judith Hirschfeld clarified her guns. She said she was thinking more of the guns and steel and not the germs as starting off with the advantage.
Well, certainly. I mean, the interesting thing is when was it Eric the Red from Iceland sailed to Newfoundland, I think it was, you know, in 10 something or other, and had the settlement, that is, you know, the Icelandic settlement, and they encountered what they called the Skraelings. That is, those were the Native Americans, and eventually they just couldn't fend off the Skraelings, and they gave up and went back to Iceland. So at that point, the Native Americans had a technological advantage over the invaders.
Or a numeric advantage.
Right. I'm going to open this up to, we have 2 people raise their hand, one being Nick Rosen, and I'm going to allow him to talk, and then I'm going to let Heather Ramoff talk a bit.
It was actually Eric's son, Leif Erikson, who sailed from Greenland to,
Did I say Iceland? I meant Greenland. Okay.
yes.
Yeah.
All right,
E- e-
I'm next up. Oops. Let
I
me,
stand corrected.
okay, let me go find Heather on this list.
So while we're looking for Heather's contact, your audience started out with 21 people, but very quickly grew to 42 people.
Oh, wow.
And I've been looking at the remarks, and I think that all of us feel that, one, your presentation was very well presented, very well written, very well illustrated, and it was a pleasure to have you being the presenter of this today. I think we've all kind of enjoyed it very much, and thank you for a wonderful job today.
Oh,
Yeah,
well, thanks. Much appreciated. It's been very helpful for me to try and pin this stuff down for a presentation, and I really appreciate having such an audience.
Yeah, it's been quite fun to do this. I don't see Heather, but I'm going to unmute if I can find Mark Sullivan to talk about Heather Ramoff has an upcoming book. Mark, you there?
I'm here.
Can you talk a little bit about Heather's book since she has left?
Well, I just found out about it today. Shepherd Wallen, publishers in London, England, is sent to CGO a book review by Fred Harrison of Heather Ramoff's forthcoming title that they're publishing. Now, I don't have the title in front of me, but it's got sex.
What does sex have to do with it, I think?
Yeah, that's it. Okay, and it seems to be dealing with some of what you, Polly, have been talking about. They're offering, I guess, something like a pre-order discount if we CGO promote it, to our contacts, and I think it's a good idea. Shepherd Wallen subsidizes its George's books by the sale of its other books. And they do a beautiful job of publishing, and many of us got to spend a little time with the founder, Anthony Werner, at CGO. I think it was 2018.
Yeah, when we climbed those pyramids.
Yeah.
That was 17. 18 would have been when we had the gentleman from Shepherd Wallen at Baltimore. So yeah.
But I imagine, unless there's some objection, we will pass on this offer, and I think it's good to support George's publishing, and anybody who knows Heather, I think, knows to expect a really good read, and it'd be great to have Polly and Heather discuss further. I guess you call this an anthropological approach to George's issues.
Yeah.
It does have something to do with health, and there have been a few other George's books. I'm thinking of a author who was a doctor whose last name was Miller. Was it George Miller? Who wrote a book connecting land ownership and taxation with human health and longevity. So that's sort of what I know. I don't have the information right in front of me.
Right, but at least we'll promote it out on our mailing list.
You can pre-order from Amazon, by the way.
Yeah.
Also.
So I actually believe the administrative assistant who sent me the note earlier this morning is on. So if we've messed it up, if you can put what we've done, other information in the chat, we'd appreciate it. So with that, let's see if we've got any more questions. Yeah. Oh, Caitlin, she said the book will arrive soon. So she was listening in, and the administrative assistant. We thank you.
Oh, Heather is back.
Yeah, there's Heather. Good. Timing. Beautiful.
Hi, Heather.
I went to my other meeting. It was much more boring than this one, and so I just came back. I am not very good with media stuff, with technology. And I tried to send a message, but don't know that I was successful. I
Well,
just,
you got to me a little bit, so good. And you were
Yeah.
just at the end, so we can talk a little bit about your book. We've done a little bit of promoing for you about your
oh,
book coming
okay.
out.
Well, it's UK release. I just learned this morning will be the end of this month. And the launch in the States will probably be the end of April. The title of it is What Sex Got to Do with It? Darwin, Love, Lust, and the Anthropocene. And it has a peacock's tail on the cover. I deal pretty much exclusively with sexual selection, very much challenge Darwin's interpretation of how sexual selection works. He argued that sexual selection was for beauty. I say nonsense. Sexual selection was for any trait that enabled babies to get born. I make the distinction, very similar to Darwin's distinction between natural selection and sexual selection. Sexual selection determines who gets born. Natural selection determines what happens to them after they're born. And I argue that females of all species select for a whole range of traits, and that sexual selection enables evolution to happen very rapidly. And Darwin's pigeons, that artificial selection I refer to as sexual selection by proxy. It's simply sexual selection that's being controlled by someone other than a member of the species that's giving birth. But I turn to Henry George in the end and say that his understanding of economics gives us a solution to both inequality and climate change. And I deal very much with the importance of language and language is symbolic communication. All species have communication, but only humans of all the trillions of species that have ever existed in the billions of years that this planet has been spinning around, only humans evolved symbolic communication. And it is our symbolic control of natural resources that has so distorted, destroyed equality, and is probably going to destroy the planet unless we change it around. But anyhow, Polly, I thought your talk was just terrific. I found it fascinating in all ways. I found the discussion equally fascinating. And as I said, I quickly went to my other meeting. It was very boring. So I left that one and came back to this.
Priceless. So thank you ever so much. With that, we'll see you next month, and we're gonna have more of this. We started this out with natural law and Ed Dotson last month, and we'll continue on with the series. It looks like we've got some interesting stuff coming up. Thank you all very much, and have a good evening. Bye for now.
Thanks, and congratulations, Polly. It was really great,
you.
fascinating.
Thank you.